Okay, now, can you everyone see okay? Yeah? Okay, awesome, thank you. So thank you for coming to today's presentation, Affordable and Appropriate Old House Care, our preservation do's and don'ts. So as Daniel said, I'm Jen Robinson, and I work as a preservation services manager, focusing mainly in Southern New England for historic New England. So just to give a little intro, a plug for Historic New England in case you're not familiar with what we do. You may be familiar with us after visiting one of our 38 historic museums. We have Otis House in Boston, Gropius House in Lincoln. We also have a collection of over 100,000 objects, which are located in our facility in Haverhill. We have an archive with over 100,000 documents, and we offer public programs related to any number of preservation and history topics, covering all 6 New England states. So within my team and what I do, the preservation services team generally partnerships between Historic New England and other people interested specifically in preservation. So I work mainly with our preservation easement program, which provides legal protection to about 118 and counting houses throughout the region. We also strategically advocate for different issues, different preservation questions or problems across the region. We offer historic homeowner services. I was telling Daniel earlier, things like paint consultation for members. And we also offer field schools, lectures, preservation education for a variety of different topics. So today I'm here to cover a bit about preservation approaches to caring for old homes. And just to give you an idea of what we'll be covering, we're going to look at sort of the philosophy behind preservation. What does it actually mean to preserve? We're going to look at how to read changes made to old houses, how you might look at an old house and start to understand how it changed over time, which is important to informing the decisions you make later down the line. We're going to take a look at some approaches to additions. And then we're going to take a look at some ideas for repairs and recapturing historic character, as well as some common repair mistakes that are made in the process. And lastly, we're going to take a look at ways to consider synthetic substitutes, which I know is an issue that comes up a lot with building projects, and also ways to improve energy efficiency in old houses. Oops. So just to set a little bit of scope, there's a few important things to keep in mind when I'm talking about historic houses, and they might seem obvious, but I really want to get at the root of why old buildings matter in the first place. So first, there's much more accumulated meaning in a historic building. So a historic building often adds a vital context to neighborhoods. It connects a tangible part of the past to the present. So it's not really just about aesthetics, although people tend to get hung up on aesthetics. It's really about what makes a place distinct and how people use historic buildings to establish a sense of place and meaning. So as we begin to add or manipulate a historic building, it's a good idea to consider first long-term impacts and things like reversibility. Second, the sheer longevity of some historic buildings that you're going to see gives them a certain rarity value. So as we begin to approach the climate crisis from a number of different angles, this longevity can actually be considered an asset. So the fact that a building has survived over 200, 300 years is in and of itself a feat of sustainable design and materials, when many buildings today may only have a 50 or 60 year expected lifespan. So there's a responsibility, I think, to think about through the impacts and longevity of any new interventions you're making as well. And Last, it's important to keep in mind, I think, when approaching a new project, that each historic building should be approached with at least a broad understanding of where it came from. So a common error in rehab projects is to just assume that a modern method can be easily applied to a historic building without any consequence. And I'm going to show some examples where more careful forethought would result in a more successful outcome. So all this doesn't mean that historic buildings shouldn't evolve, just that consideration of, several factors should inform some careful and thoughtful design decisions. So speaking of which, as we start here with a little bit of background and philosophy, one of the most important things to remember before approaching a historic house project is how a house has evolved over time. And you see here the Lyman Estate, which is where I am now. It's where my office is, which has evolved over 225 years. So when I say historic New England is preserving this place, what exactly do I mean? So historic preservation is really a kind of a philosophy about how to treat old buildings. And it's been defined in a number of different ways by different people over the years. But I really like the way it's defined by James Garvin, who wrote A Building History of Northern New England. And he said, let the changes you make to your property be additive rather than subtractive. Try to make your work add to the legacy of the past so that you can pass a dwelling of even greater value and comfort to the future. And remember that the number of old houses is finite and diminishes each year. So it's a privilege and a responsibility to actually own a piece of the past. And you can see that kind of additive approach here at Spencer Pierce Little Farm. This is in Newburyport. It's a historic New England property. The earliest part of the house is from the 1690s at the right. And there's an addition at the left from the 1790s. And then there's modified Victorian interiors. So a lot going on in one single structure. So preservation professionals use National Park Service preservation philosophy. And this standard also applies to projects that receive historic tax credit. So if you've ever been involved in a project like that, you may be familiar with some of these terms. The National Park Service definition of preservation is actually quite narrow. Their meaning of preservation means minimal intervention, just enough ongoing maintenance and repair to sustain a building in its existing form and materials and integrity. So new exterior additions are not included in their definition of preservation. Sensitive upgrading of mechanicals and building systems is. So as you can guess, many museums fall into this preservation category. In contrast, rehabilitation does make allowances for creating new and compatible uses through repair, through alterations. And this is really important, preserving the portions or features which convey its historical or cultural value. So that's something we're going to talk about throughout the presentation. Restoration is essentially bringing a property back to a particular period of time in its history. It's either removing evidence or adding to bring it back to a particular time. And lastly is the rare case of reconstruction, where there's a wholesale recreation of a building outright or a feature that doesn't exist anymore. So as you might have noticed, looking at those four terms, they're used differently in different contexts. And I like to point this out because I think it's important to define what you actually mean if you're working with a contractor or working in a historic house project. So working with a contractor, it's more common to use words like preservation, renovation, and remodeling. So preservation and restoration are generally used in the same sense as that I just discussed, the idea of preservation being a conservative approach, restoration bringing something back to its quote, quote, original condition, whatever that may be defined as. Renovation, you can think of it as more closely related to rehabilitation in terms of the National Park Service, the adaptation of a building to modern needs. But remodeling generally is a profit-driven approach. So something that has less concern with historic integrity and more with eliminating variables or maximizing a profit. So at Historic New England, we took elements of the National Park Service and many other nonprofit groups and people who work in preservation over the years and created our own philosophy in 2009. And so our philosophy includes researching and documenting before a project even begins. What are we actually looking at, and how will that impact future decisions that we make, 50 years, 100 years down the line? We monitor features. So we monitor change over time, so paint or wood, to make a plan for repair and replacement if needed of specific features. We preserve historic materials, so we're not just concerned about the outward appearance of something, but actually preserving the integrity of a material as long as possible. Obviously wood rots, but we try to maintain it as long as we can. We preserve the design and craftsmanship of the original structure. And of course, we share what we know with others, like we're doing today, and we try to follow or improve on national best practices, particularly by learning from others. So obviously our goals for our museum sites are different than those of the typical homeowner at Historic New England, but I think that philosophy provides a really solid baseline for many of the concepts that we're going to be looking at. And I'm going to start with a little quiz, which I know you can just sort of chime in your head. If we were live, I would have people, raise their hand and chime in. But we're going to take a look at a few examples to consider the different preservation philosophies that I've just gone over. So this is one of my favorites. This is one of the most iconic residences of 20th century America, the Brady House. Interestingly, at the Brady residence, at least its exterior did actually exist in real life. However, like any home, it went through changes between the 70s and the 2020s. So you see the before photo. And just talking about the exterior, do you think this looks like a preservation work, renovation or rehab, which would adapt the property to modern needs, or restoration? So in this case, it's actually restoration. Elements that show how the house evolved over time have been removed to show how it appeared at a specific moment in time. I should note that the National Register standard for what constitutes a historic building is 50 years. So that means buildings constructed 1972 or later. And I know Daniel and I were talking about this the other day. So the Brady House is now actually National Register eligible, which is kind of interesting. So here's maybe a little bit more challenging example. You see a historic image at the left and a modern photo on the right. So would we consider what was done on the right preservation, renovation, rehabilitation, or remodeling, which would discard historic character in favor of standard sort of commercial materials and methods? So in this case, we're looking at remodeling. The historic house has been sort of eroded and diminished through the addition of vinyl windows, a standard commercial entry porch, and vinyl siding. So the bare bones of the house are probably actually still there, but it's sort of been eroded by these new changes. Okay, and then how about this example? This one actually got me the first time I did it. So this is also remodeling and not preservation, even though the house looks more historic than it used to on the left-hand side. So if you compare the older image to the current one, You can see things, changes to windows, both at the front and along the L off the back. So they've been elongated, sort of changed on the side. There's a new door surround, there's new pilasters, there's a large addition at the rear that kind of looks like a barn. So these aren't actually historic features that existed at a specific point in time. So there's no evidence that this house ever looked anything like this, which is why it can't be considered preservation. And lastly, how about this case? So this case would be considered rehabbing. The owner has opened up the historic porch that you see in the front and has put on an addition that allowed for enlargement of the space, accommodating modern needs, but they've clearly brought many design elements from the main house over into the new addition. So the truth is that most houses are either rehabbed or remodeled. And here's a couple examples of efforts that are trying to improve an old house and make it look more interesting maybe, but neither of them is actually preserving the character of the house or considering its actual historical context. So at the left, they've obviously tried to make the house look more appealing through shutters, through adding different elements over the door, but it's actually obscuring the original evolution of the house, which starts really at the front elevation. And at the right, you see a mid-century ranch house that's being made to try to look like a craftsman bungalow, which we also see quite frequently, changing a style. So before you start making changes in a house, let's take a look at how an old house evolves over time, or different examples of that, and start to read the changes that have already happened. So one common way old houses have changed is by getting larger. And you can see that here by looking at the sheathing board. So in this example, this section of the house dates to the 18th century, where the sheathing boards are laid vertically. And then we see a 19th century extension at the right, where the sheathing boards are laid horizontally. So attic spaces are actually one of my favorite places to look first, to see if I can see any elements that show where additions have taken place over time. And certainly basements are as well. Porches and windows were often the first things that were updated in an older house. And this is a really good example of a colonial revival porch being tacked on to an Italianate house. So both the porch and the house are significant features, but those windows could actually be original, the 2/2 windows. Okay, now this is an interesting one too. Knowing that mansard roofs were easy to add helps you to kind of decipher this photo. So adding a mansard roof in the 19th century was a common way of editing a 18th century house. So in this case, the owner actually decided to restore their house to an earlier Georgian configuration by removing the mansard roof. So I think at Historic New England, we would try to preserve changes over time, and that's one choice, but there's also this choice of bringing it back to a specific period. So in the process of construction, as you begin to peel back those layers, I like to look for clues that might help to determine how a house evolved, like I talked about the roof earlier. The first photo you see here I took recently at a house in Connecticut, and we noticed that the studs in the wall had been cut diagonally and kind of added on. So that was evidence that there was an earlier gable actually attached to this wall, which was really interesting in the context of this project. Oftentimes when you remove vinyl siding or cladding, you can find ghosted features like this Palladian window that had been replaced by a single sash. So you can kind of see the shadow of original features. I also look out for builders' signatures. It's easy to kind of overlook these if you have many people working on a site at the same time, but They're really interesting and help to date specific changes because oftentimes they're dated or signed. And I like looking in small spaces like closets or crawl spaces to see if there's any wallpaper or other evidence left behind that shows different design schemes or changes. So as in the past, we're going to take a look at additions. As in the past, owners today often want to expand their house, obviously. And historically, additions took place in sort of a vernacular ad hoc fashion. And we see here, this is one of my favorite pictures, I think, in the presentation. It was taken by Charles McKim in 1874 in Newport. And in pursuit of a uniquely American architecture was what he was trying to decipher. He actually took pictures of the rear of houses rather than the front because he was interested in those different accumulations over time. So in contrast, common issues we see with adding onto old houses include what we see here. And this is obviously an extreme example, but it's easy to see how the addition at the left went wrong. It doesn't respect the scale or the vocabulary of the historic house. It doesn't consider the massing and proportions of the historic house. And essentially, these are just two completely distinct ideas jammed together and arguing with each other. The new addition doesn't really add anything compatible to the story that the old house is telling. And if you've worked on an extension to an old house, as I'm sure many of you have, you've probably encountered variations on the next three arguments that I'm going to point out. And these are three different principles, particularly as a preservationist would approach in looking at an addition. And it's important to remember that these are all value judgments. So what might be acceptable in one context may not be in another. So the first concept of these three is matching. And this is sometimes derided as pastiche by some because it doesn't allow for a clear reading of a building and its authenticity value. So it's difficult to decipher which parts are new and which parts are original. And you'll see at the top the sketch of the museum that's going to carry through the next two slides. And in this case, the addition is the mass at the right. So perhaps one of the more notable examples of residential pastiche was Prince Charles's Poundbury Village, which was derided by critics as having sort of a Disney-esque feel or interpretation of traditional British building. But it's actually interesting to note, and this article I clipped as from 2016, that a survey of residents suggests a generally positive reception after 20 years. So again, it's really a value judgment. Now, the second approach is compatibility, and this is what the National Park Service has determined that they feel is the most appropriate for a historic building. So in this example, we see a house that's carried over its materiality from the main house, but the fenestration patterns are modern, the trim and detailing has been certainly streamlined, and the setbacks make it clear that the historic house is the dominant feature. So compatible additions might use things like hyphens, to create a separation between old and new to make that clear, and materials might differ slightly. However, some people might argue that there's still elements of pastiche here. Is it too close to the original? And so those debates between matching or compatibility can really go on and on. Now, lastly is differentiation, and it's a choice made, and I know Daniel and I were talking about this the other day too, that is used in big public projects like museums. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum is a really good example. And differentiation itself I think should be viewed in relationship to the modernist movement. The idea that new architecture should just diverge completely and be independent of past models. So on a residential scale, this often translates to sort of modernist stripping of ornamentation and form. And this is a house that I drive by every day in Newton. And it was just really interesting to take a look at the use of materials. Glass, which is often considered transparent, can have different effects when it's actually installed. There's two different kinds of stone happening here. So the original stone and the stone that's being added, how do those two interact? And so those are all questions related to making something look so different that is it really compatible with the original structure? I think you could debate that. Oops, oh no. Okay, we're back. So now that we've thought about some of these philosophical underpinnings, let's take a closer look at some of the practical approaches to repair and retrofits. So I'm going to be showing some examples of how character can be recaptured in a building project, and also some tips related to repair of major building components. So specifically with carpentry and masonry. So before I get into that, because I think this is the point where we start to run into maybe some bureaucracy and people have questions about, well, how does this apply in this certain circumstance? So I love this picture because it shows, you know, at least 3 different plaques, and it's a good example of a house that has different layers of protection. So at the federal level, like I talked, the National Register, it's really interesting to note, and many people don't quite understand that a National Register designation is really an honorary designation. It doesn't necessarily protect a house from demolition. So they're relevant to a property receiving a historic tax credit, so using taxpayer money. They can also trigger something called Section 106 review, which is a process that requires the federal government to evaluate proposed federal work, say like a road or a highway on a historic property, but it doesn't necessarily prevent demolition or change. In contrast, most protection for historic buildings in the US comes from historic districts, which you probably have interacted with if you've worked on an old house. And it's because of the US's emphasis on private property rights that the discretion for protection is actually handed over to the local government versus other, like you might see in the UK and Europe. Houses are, as you know, generally often only protected from public view sheds, again, emphasizing aspects of the house that have public benefit. And a third type of protection, which is the one that I deal in the most, and I'm happy to answer more questions about this at the end, are preservation easements or deed restrictions. So this is probably the strictest form of preservation in the US. It can protect not only all elevations, but also elements of interiors like woodwork or masonry. And the restriction is perpetual. So no matter how many times the house gets sold to new owners, those protections carry through. So Historic New England has one of the largest easement programs in the US. So taking a look now at how character is eroded over time, we see in the top image how an Italian house has been slowly stripped of its detailing. So it kind of results in a building that looks flat and one-dimensional. At the bottom, we see another example. I took this photo, or I pass this building quite frequently as well. And although at first glance, the house on the right looks historic when you first approach it, there's actually many elements that have been taken away or altered. For example, the porch details or the roof corbels. So those are here on the left, and they were taken away during the renovation. And there's also a craftsman style door, which, because of the popularity of HDTV, stock materials, this seems to be the preferred historic door choice as of late. So if a house was sided with vinyl or aluminum at some point, removing it's a great way to restore or recapture historic character, at least to see what details might be missing. If you want an idea of what a house might look like, or might have looked like, you might look to the surrounding neighborhood. This photograph was taken at a neighboring house, and it shows what a well-preserved Italianate house would have had with its corbels and its trim, and could inform design decisions on the house on the left. And then, so removing vinyl siding is likely going to expose some issues that will need to be repaired. So when the vinyl was initially installed, the surface had to be made flat and free of obstruction, which is how you lose all those materials. So you also see the addition of furring strips and siding components that were most likely nailed directly to the underlying wood surface, which can impact the quality of the wood underneath and its state of repair. Vinyl sidings also applied often as a stopgap measure, a quick way of covering underlying issues, which I've seen before. And this could mainly include drainage issues. So rot is a common problem when you're removing vinyl siding. And you can see different features that have been uncovered. At the upper left, you have this really delicate detail that could be reproduced by a millwork company. And you see how you have the shadow of shutters on this side elevation. A little door was revealed off the kitchen. And I think millwork companies are a good resource for stock molding patterns and details that could be reasonable approximations of details and get you the degree of sort of dimensionality that a project requires. Now, one reason why preservationists are adamant about retention of historic windows, and windows is a whole other topic that could be just one presentation, but the reason that preservationists are really particular about historic windows is that it's difficult to replicate the dimensionality and detailing of things like muntin shapes, which you can see how they changed over the years as window technology changed. And so it might seem like a small detail, but when multiplied across a whole elevation, it can have a big impact. Stock windows, unfortunately, also can't really come close to imitating windows that have non-standard glazing patterns, such as the one you see at the bottom right. And another issue is that it's very difficult to insert new window models into older frames. A lot of times that frame has to be either manipulated or removed just to make the windows fit. And if it's not properly adjusted, that can also result in air leaks, which is often one of the justifications for putting in replacement windows in the first place. So just to have a little introduction to paint, I know I was saying earlier that we do offer a whole separate paint lecture, but I think this will give you just a good baseline overview. You've probably noticed in some of the examples that I've shown that paint is a good way to recapture historic character in an old house. And as a general rule of thumb, for most New England houses, the maximum number of paint colors was 3. So as we see here, paint scheme books are great primary sources, particularly in the 19th century, early 20th century, for getting ideas of paint schemes that were popular. And so just to provide a little bit of context, historically, the older your house is, the fewer number of colors that were available, because colors at this time were obviously being derived from natural sources. So pre-Civil War, pigments were derived from things like clay or charcoal. Yellow ochre, for example, was derived from an oxide containing clay. So it created cream and straw and other bright yellow colors. Red iron oxide is sourced from clay as well. And it was popular for barns because it was inexpensive. And that's how we ended up with the big red barn. Bone black was derived from charcoal produced by burning animal bones, and it was used to create grays. Other organic pigments like indigo or verdigris from copper patina were more expensive, and they weren't color fast, particularly on the exteriors. They weren't typically used in the 18th century. Whitewash, which is a mixture of lime and water, was the cheapest and probably the most common exterior coating for buildings before the 1860s, which is why we also see a lot of white buildings in New England. Now, by the late 1850s, the first synthetic dyes were developed and came on the market. And from this discovery, there was a huge new industry that was available to the mass market. So a much broader range of paint colors and a lot of printed material that showed people different options that they could have for paint schemes. And historic research shows, as I said earlier, that typically a 3-color paint scheme was the most common, including the body, which is all siding and shingles, the trim, which would be all other woodwork, and then the sash. So thinking of anything that moves, sash, doors, storm windows, shutters. And although color choices can affect first impressions, it's actually the color placement that can be the real key to a successful paint campaign. There's a few exceptions to the 3-color scheme, like Queen Anne houses that have lots of detailing might add a 4th color to pick out those carved details. But in general, the 3-color scheme is a good rule of thumb. Now, in terms of present day color choice, unless a historic district regulates color, it's really an aesthetic preference. And there isn't necessarily a wrong choice, just one that might not fit a particular historic context. It just depends on the level of preservation that a particular project demands. So for most 18th and 19th century styles, painters were trying to replicate the appearance of stone, or we're trying to blend a building into the natural environment. So things like vivid blues and purples, like you see at the left, were typically not common color schemes. Those colors were also the most unstable and they would fade unevenly. So again, they weren't typically used on the exterior. For the house on the right, the mustard color, and those muted earth tones are good, but there's too many trim colors. You have 2 different shades of mustard, you have the white, and the sash doesn't match the trim. And for that reason, it just doesn't really follow a historic precedent. So we often get a lot of questions about lead paint, and lead certainly played an important role in the development of paint technology. The whole reason lead was used in the first place was because when it was combined with pigment and linseed oil, it helped for better adhesion and drying and overall coverage properties. However, we now understand that lead obviously has adverse health effects, and most paint has shifted over to water-based latex. However, I will say that there are several manufacturers of oil paints. They're independent manufacturers, but they're both environmentally and health friendly. And they're going back to using an oil-based pigment. And instead of lead, these paints are substituting zinc instead. And they can, although they are more expensive, the results can be actually much longer lasting than latex the wood tends to really absorb the oil and only requires periodic touch-up. One of those brands is AutoSan. Our carpenters have been starting to use that. So it's an option out there for a longer term paint solution rather than that cyclic 5 to 7 year constant scraping and repainting. Okay, so now we're just gonna shift to the bare bones of this structure and take a closer look at framing. Because framing is important in its own right, particularly if the building dates to the 18th century or earlier. Sometimes the framing is the only evidence we have left of the original construction. So it's important to understand as you begin to manipulate a building, how the technology of its frame can impact structural stability. And a timber post and beam frame is going to behave much differently than the later balloon frame and present day platform frame. So timber frames were used in New England from the 17th century, really up to the mid 19th century, up until mass production allowed for the balloon frame. And the timber frame will use far fewer but larger components. So the chimney is usually a distinct part of the mass, and it actually sometimes supports surrounding framing members. And so the weight in a timber frame is transferred down through the vertical posts into the sill, and the braces act as anchors that keep the whole house plumb. So I was just in Nantucket and I saw an instance, or was pointed out to me, an instance where somebody was trying to pour a concrete basement. So they had jacked up the 18th century house without thinking through carefully of what that would do. So what it ended up doing was racking the building. So it started to shift, and interior features like molding and plaster started to crack because the whole building started to move. So you really have to think things carefully with things through carefully with an older frame, because the shifts can be dramatic. And the same goes for removing the chimney mass, which a lot of people like to do to try to create an open floor plan. But again, there's framing members connected to that that are reliant on the chimney mass. So things to think through. As I said, the balloon frame was then the progression after the post and beam frame. And it was a result of industrial production of lumber. So more standard pieces, more availability of transportation across large spans of the country. And there was less skill and time required to actually build with a balloon frame. So with a balloon frame, you see standard sizes, standard spacing, studs are running from the sill to the rafter plate. And so the load is dispersed across a larger area, which means that there's generally some more flexibility in terms of removing or manipulating select pieces on the interior or exterior walls. So when we look at framing and framing repair, wherever possible, we try to look at framing repairs as additive rather than subtractive. So in our easement program, for example, we look at adding supplementary joists like you see at the right, doing a splice repair rather than full removal. So keeping as much of the original wood as possible, but splicing in where needed. And maybe using some supplementary materials like steel plates or other small areas that can provide extra support but maintain the original structural frame. Now, most of New England's building tradition is with wood, and that's really because timber was plentiful in North America in the 17th and 18th centuries, and that wood building tradition continues through till today. However, it's worthwhile to consider what different materials, how they can impact bricks and other soft porous stones. So oftentimes we see people trying to use cement mortars, and with cement mortars or very hard mortars, the water can't drain evenly away from the surface of the porous stone or brick, which will eventually cause falling and degradation, particularly during freeze-thaw cycles. And you can see this on the surface of the bricks here. So in the case of missing mortar, we ask for or suggest looking for a mason with experience in traditional mortars. They should be using a lime-based mortar, which has a composition closer to the bricks and acts as sort of a sacrificial layer. So with that, you should pay close attention to how the width and the style of the joints is also being reproduced in the process. And to wrap this section, I used this example. This is a house in Brookline. And I like what the architects did here because they were able to maintain two important historic features, the 17th and 18th century framing that's in the attic, as well as this brick nogging, which is pretty unusual to see. It's the brick infill that you see between the wood. And it's an English building tradition that came over to the New World. And so instead of destroying these important features, they decided to cover rather than alter the framing. So they were able to disguise their rigid board insulation in the attic by adding wood paneling. And they also restored the pointing between the really soft nogging bricks and then left some of them exposed, which I thought was a nice touch that kind of combined old and new and made the whole attic space functional. Now, a quick word on code compliance, which I'm sure you've run into in any number of projects. And you may discover with working in old buildings, there's always a surprise that pops up. So when it comes to code compliance, historic buildings may or may not receive special consideration. So it's always good to ask, depending on the state or the municipality that you're working with. And it's worth checking the code and talking directly with the building inspector. So don't necessarily assume that a historic building has to conform to same code requirements as new build. This happened at the Lyman Estate. So because our porch on the left is less than 18 inches off grade, it didn't need railings. And I'm seeing this a lot in our easement properties. People are able to add these sort of metal hoods above their 18th century fireplaces. So they're able to still have a functional fireplace while meeting fire code. So meaning there's enough distinction between wood and the area where the fire is actually taking place. And this is another really good example of augmenting something rather than subtracting from it. So this is at a public library. They obviously needed a taller railing, but instead of removing elements of the historic railing, they just added onto the top. All right, so far we've taken a look at a lot of traditional materials, but I'd like to take a look now at the burgeoning field of substitute materials. So new options for synthetic alternatives that are appearing frequently for every aspect of building. So vinyl windows and siding, permastone cladding, decorative architectural shingles, and AZEK. So in most cases, in historic house projects, we don't recommend replacing traditional materials with the idea of a quote unquote no maintenance alternative. However, we do realize that homeowners are being confronted with growing shortages of quality wood, skilled tradespeople, and changes in regulations and code requirements. So what are the long-term consequences of using substitute materials? We know, for example, that asphalt shingles behave in a certain way at this point. They've been on the market for a long time. But what about proprietary materials that haven't really existed long enough for accurate study? So what we've done is to create sort of a basic framework as homeowners are approaching substitute materials. And we suggest that they start by weighing a few considerations about the resource before even going out and purchasing anything. So we ask them to weigh what the significance of the building is that they're working on. Is it the main house? Is it a small garden shed? What is the significance of the actual element? Is it just a stair riser, or is it something carved? Is it something that's prominent on the front, or is it tucked into the back of a side elevation? And is the original deteriorated enough to justify this replacement? And I think it's also really important to keep in mind what you might be losing with removal. There's certainly a short-term gain in terms of quick maintenance, but the loss of old growth wood really can't be matched. You see here the density of the wood in 1918 versus 2018. And this is definitely true in the case of window repair. Vinyl replacement windows have a 20-odd year lifespan and can't be repaired. And even if you replace them with modern wood replicas, that wood isn't going to last as long as a historic example. So the replacement wood window may only last 20 or 30 years as well. So really be careful about what wood you're removing. And then after someone's decided that a synthetic material might be appropriate, you'll need to take a careful look at the specs for each product. So we look at things like color and texture, not only at the time of installation, but as the new material begins to deteriorate, as it inevitably will. What maintenance does this material require? Will it need to be painted or painted frequently to match a certain other part of the structure? If it gets damaged, like a PVC fence in a snowstorm, can it be repaired? What is the cost to install or maintain or replace a material? And how will it impact surrounding fabric? So all these materials are going to expand and contract at different rates than most likely the wood that's around them. They'll absorb moisture differently, and they might weigh more, for example, cementitious siding. So all of those factors interacting with the historic building are important to consider before making a final choice. And as we think about the proprietary products of today, I just had to capture these ads from Historic New England's collections database. It's good to put them in perspective. So yesterday's sort of new and improved lifetime guarantee products are in today's landfill pile. I don't think many people would recognize WeatherTech shingles or Bolt-A-Wall vinyl tile today. And I was wondering, will AZEK be the same thing as aluminum siding of yesteryear? So in the context of the climate crisis, I think careful consideration of life cycle cost of substitute materials in particular is important. And the research on their real longevity has yet to be really scoped out. Now, one area where we have found particular success with substitute materials is with gutters. And that's because gutters, first of all, wood gutters, are exposed to weather and water constantly and all the time. And most of the time they've been replaced more than once. And new wood just isn't as durable as it used to be. Plus, there's an added factor of the intensity of rainstorms. So you can see how the profile it's thick and it can't keep up with the amount of rain that's sheeting off the roof relative to the capacity of these thinner materials. So what we're recommending now to homeowners in our easement program, or at least taking a look at, is the use of fiberglass or copper gutters, not the K-style sort of aluminum gutters that you see here, but the ones in the middle. Those can accurately replicate the profile of a wood gutter, and viewed from a distance, it still maintains the overall character. And in this case, they reproduced both the trough and the gutter, and this is all fiberglass painted. And it ended up really helping this particular homeowner with some flooding issues that they were having. So that's a good example of where substitutes do work. Other areas that have a lot of moisture issues, like water tables, is another area to consider. And also sort of visually distant materials, visually distant areas, but materials that rot quite often, like a roof baluster, that might be another area to consider. So on an interesting side note, I had to include some more mid-century things. Many of our mid-century buildings are now reaching the point of repair. So a lot of them use experimental plastics and different experimental materials. So what does that mean in terms of authenticity when we go to replace those materials? We have a fiberboard or a fiberglass carport roof on the top right in Lincoln. We had to recently replace some broken glass blocks that are at Gropius House at the bottom right. And so finding appropriate replacements can be difficult, and you have to kind of make, it's really a question between design intent and material science or intent. You have to kind of debate that out philosophically, but it's a really interesting field, and the Getty has done a lot of work on this, if anyone's interested. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is energy efficiency. And I'm sure it's relevant to many projects that you're working on, whether they're new or whether they're old. The first thing I like to point out is that energy efficiency isn't necessarily a new concept. People have always been trying to conserve energy just because it was difficult to go and get coal and chop down trees for heat. So we see really interesting insulation, essentially. The nogging is one. Eelgrass insulation, I've seen in Nantucket where there's actual seaweed in the walls. So you might uncover that in some of your projects. And of course, movable shutters were used often to shield out heat or cool in the winter. So a lot of passive house builders are using some of these concepts in their work, looking back towards the past to inform design decisions. In the 19th century, the double hung sash was meant to be open both at the top and the bottom to create convection airflow. And radiators were often positioned beneath windows to create convection airflow in the winter. Sash locks were used to keep windows tightly closed and seal out drafts, and people used rugs and thick curtains to also insulate individual openings. So we know that contributing to energy efficiency is a really important issue. And this chart shows data from the National Energy Information Administration, and you can see that the residential sector consumes about 21% of the energy in the US out of these four categories. So with that in mind, just looking at residential, of that 21%, 62% of the country's 140 million houses were built after 69. So in National Register terms, so the 50-year mark, that means about 8% of our national energy use is by houses that are over 50 years old. And if we break that down even further to just consider houses that are 80 years or older, that would be about 2.5% of US energy consumption. So old houses are not necessarily the biggest problem when it comes to overall energy consumption. the idea of knocking them down for new ultra efficient construction isn't going to solve all of our global energy problems. And this is particularly true when we think of what it takes to transport material, dispose of old material, and the overall general size of homes, which has increased about 30% since 2000. So you'll see many different energy calculations by many different groups, sort of cost benefit analysis, but in that we should also be considering the cost of demolition of building waste and materials life cycle into the overall equation. Now, we are lucky, and I like to see it as an opportunity rather than an impediment, that that New England still has a lot of old houses. So between 22 and 32% of housing stock in New England is over 80 years old. So it's worth thinking about how we as a region can continue to increase the energy efficiency of old houses. And I'm sure your clients are looking to save money and, of course, increase thermal comfort. So the energy efficiency upgrades that are getting the most attention, I think, recently in the news are the deep energy retrofits that we've seen in the Boston area. So in preservation terms, these can be complicated. And that's because they involve a certain level of experimentation when they involve a historic house, and because of gaps in expertise and testing in several areas. So for most average homeowners, the idea of wrapping a house with rigid foam, installing geothermal heating plants can be very expensive. It can be very invasive, and is at risk for a long-term failure, when we think of a beyond 20, 30, 40 years. So the standard deep energy retrofit, which really requires conditioning of the entire space, really tight air sealing and moisture control, and management of HVAC, presumes a high level of expertise on the part of designers and installers, and as well as the ultimate users that are going to be using the house. And it often, in a historic context, includes substantial loss of materials and finishes. So while it does reduce energy use, the retrofits that we're seeing may have more moving parts than an old house can handle. They're designed for new construction and don't necessarily fit with older houses that have moved or settled or have been altered many times already. So we really do need more information on how these types of retrofits will function long-term and new materials like insulation. We need a better understanding of historical methods and practices on the building technology side, and also more training and specialized expertise on the building trade side. So until then, our best advice for older homeowners is to keep the energy interventions at a simpler level that considers reversibility and proceeds slowly. So if we can concentrate on enhancing houses in that way and test out these new materials on newer houses, I think the outcome will be better in the long run. Now, to close with an example of our very own energy efficiency project, this is back at the Lyman Estate, where we completed not a deep, but a shallow comprehensive energy retrofit. And we were able to achieve a 40% reduction in our energy consumption, and the house is 14,000 square feet. It has active use both as offices and a function space, so it's not a museum. And we did it through all the steps listed on the slide. We rehabilitated over 100 historic windows with weather stripping and both interior and exterior storms, depending on the window. And we converted our oil heating to high efficiency natural gas. So we started with some performance testing, a comprehensive energy audit to see where our biggest losses were. And we also made sure that we were recording how much oil we were using at different times of the year so we could have accurate figures in the end of how we had improved. So what we did was we carefully insulated the conditioned space of the house from the unconditioned third floor. So we left the third floor unconditioned, and we sealed any gaps that were in the attic with foam, so any plumbing or any ducting. Homeowners often ask about insulating attics and basements, and insulating an attic, I think, is one of the best things that can be done because that's where a large percentage of the heat escapes. Bats, rigid foam, blown-in cellulose, those are all good and reversible options. Insulating the basement can be a little bit more complicated just because the heating systems are there. It also tends to be the space in the house that has the most moisture issues. So the most valuable area to insulate in the basement is around the sill or the rim joists and around any penetrations like you see here around utility connections or ducts. So as I was saying earlier, historic wood windows are a better product than any replacement option because they're built to be repaired so they can last. And although wood windows do need maintenance, so glazing, putty repair, periodic repainting, general tightening up, they can enhance their efficiency through weather stripping, like you see at the bottom, and adding storm windows. Interior storms in particular have evolved to the point where they can really provide a nice snug fit. And I can say from working in this office that it's actually, quite nice both in the summer and the winter. And there are many studies that will show that adding weather stripping and storm windows will provide at least an equal energy efficiency or a close energy efficiency to a double glazed new window. Now, this is one of the more interesting photos, I think. This is why old houses shouldn't be science experiments. So this is a photo that was taken of a colleague of mine in Connecticut. And it shows what we think is probably a 1970s oil crisis insulation job run amok. And this shows that it's important to really think through insulation carefully in sidewalls. It's not impossible. It's just something that needs to be considered. So in this case, there's so much moisture being held by the interior insulation that you can actually see the mold and the mildew patterning on the exterior wall. And so this is not only affecting the health, I'm sure, of the occupants, but also the building itself. And this happens sometimes with paint as well. If moisture is being held in by insulation, you'll see paint sheeting in specific areas. And these days, blown in or dense packed insulation, if it's done properly, doesn't have to result in these kind of problems. But managing moisture is very complicated. And I'm sure you realize this working with clients too, adding any kind of showers, cooking, even breathing. All that moisture is a complicated piece of building science. So it's easier to do when you have access to the wall cavities. But for most historic houses, that involves removing all the clapboards and sheathing or plaster and woodwork. So at that point, it's important to consider whether that's worth it. So we typically don't advise on spray foam insulation just because it's not reversible. However, the National Park Service does allow for spray foam insulation if a barrier is used. So you could use a barrier to make it reversible. And for projects where you may have access to wall cavities, and this is something I worked on in a project recently, they did actually have access to the wall cavity from the outside. dense cellulose or another reversible blown-in insulation could be a good solution. However, the water needs to consistently drain away from the exterior. So you can use things like drainable house wraps. The idea being that you're creating an airspace between the cladding and the walls. So there's a constant airflow. And in this scenario of blown-in insulation, I can't emphasize enough how important it's going to be long-term that the homeowners maintain all of the building envelope. So window flashings, any gaps, or other areas where the cladding is meeting an opening has to be secure. If not, that's when water can get in and start to sink into the insulation and cause those moisture problems. And a quick word on HVAC systems. So as I'm sure you're all aware, ductless systems are all the rage, particularly with new stretch codes coming in and the eventual goal of electrifying our energy grid. So in many cases, split systems have provided more flexibility in the past in historic homes. This house here that I worked on, the homeowner was able to actually route all of their HVAC through existing conduits. And so that was a really seamless approach. And most importantly, those units are easily reversible. So they can be taken out when they inevitably become defunct. Where it gets tricky is where routes aren't easily available or wall cavities are just too narrow to accommodate the conduits. So we end up with a significant amount of plastic on the exterior. A lot of times that can be disguised with paint. And I thought they did a particularly good job, not only siting this duct here, but painting it. And it's tucked in kind of a side elevation. This is an 18th century house. So there are ways to do it right if you have a contractor who can consider lots of different options and put them on the table. There's still some debate as to how well heat pumps can function in extreme cold. So it's also important to position the units in the right places and make sure that that's adequately heating the whole interior. Which brings me to my last point, that it takes time to see how a building intervention will impact historic fabric. And so in this case, we had a homeowner switch from no conditioned space to a completely new HVAC. And this is an 18th century house that had never had any kind of climate control. So when they turned it on not gradually, but just with the flip of a button. And so what we saw over the course of a few weeks was that wood started to split. You can see here any kind of stress points because the wood's starting to dry out. So this isn't the worst thing in the world. It's not causing a structural issue, but it's just something to consider, maybe gradually introducing humidity and temperature control to see if you can allow the wood to gradually change. And so in conclusion, in summary, I hope you've learned at least a few new interesting tidbits to ensure that your projects will stand the test of time. So I've made a PDF of resources that Daniel's going to share with you that includes books and other online resources that I think you'll find will be helpful. And I'll close with these 3 takeaway principles, which are to treat old houses more gently, focus more invasive interventions on newer construction, to stick with simple and reversible solutions, and to beware of sort of overcomplicated and one-size-fits-all maintenance solutions that can sound too good to be true. And I'll end with this quote from John Ruskin, who, although it's a really flowery quote, I really like it because it kind of sums up why I enjoy preservation. So he said in 1849, "When we build, let us think that we build forever. let it not be for present delight, nor for present use alone. Let it be such work as our descendants will thank us for, and let us think as we lay stone on stone that a time is to come when those stones will be held sacred because our hands have touched them, and that men will say as they look upon the labor and wrought substance of them, I should say fathers or mothers here, see this our fathers did for us. Thank you very much. And I also have to plug our summit, which is coming up in October 13th and 14th. So if you're interested in building science, if you're interested in preservation in general, urban development, any number of really interesting issues, we do invite you to come to the summit, which is going to be, I think, really interesting. The speakers list I just saw the other day. It's very interesting. So please do join us if you're at all interested. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you, Jennifer. Boy, that was comprehensive. Thank you.
I hope it wasn't too comprehensive. I tried to include as many things as I could, knowing that some people, you know, they might have experience with one thing, but not another. So
no, it was great. It was great. Thank you. I'm having trouble uploading your resources PDF to the chat room for people. So for those of you attending, if you would like, put your email in the chat and then I'll email it out to you after we've disconnected. So in listening or in monitoring the chat just for questions, and we just have a little bit of time here, I think there were some one of the most general questions, what is the definition of historic? How do you look at defining something as being historic? Is it a frame of time? Is it a style? How do you look at that as a preservationist?
yeah, I mean, that is a very interesting question because, like I said, you know, National Park Service says potentially anything over 50 years old, you know, could be historic. And obviously not every building can be preserved. You know, we're not here to say that every single building that's over 50 years old needs to be preserved. But I think one of the things I look for, there's a number of different ways. The first thing I look for is overall like material integrity. How much of the building actually still exists, or how much of it has, you know, been manipulated and changed. So that's one way to think of it. Another way, and this is, and traditionally, both that and it's a building's association with a particular person or architect, or as an exemplar of a particular style. Those were the traditional ways of thinking of things as important. Recently, there's been a shift, I think, nationally to also think of things that are intangible. So maybe something is important culturally, like a meeting center or a meeting building used in the civil rights movement, but it's lost some of its integrity through things like vinyl siding, but the actual core of the building is still there. That cultural significance weighs more heavily than the integrity. So that's a sort of second way. And I think another way to look at a building other than just its material fabric, and one that's getting a lot of attention recently.
I think that question came from, is it Kylie Moore? Did you have any follow-up question on that, Kylie?
It's Keely, actually.
Oh, Keely, I'm sorry.
No worries, it's a tricky one. I was just curious, you know, for funding and other resources, if there is a definition for, you know, where does that, I guess there's different periods of history, right? And we're always working to rehab different periods, but is there certain resources that are tied to different periods of history?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you're approaching a project, I mean, things that have been documented. So people have created National Register documentation, which is a whole process. Or there's even buildings in our own statewide MACRIS database, which I included in the PDF. Those are sort of concrete ways that you can say, okay, this has been verified. You know, these are the reasons why this building is important, and this is how it's been recorded. I don't think there's any one period where you could say this building is more worthy of preservation because it's from the 18th century. And maybe there's a building from the 1950s that's equally as, you know, rare or important. And so it does come down sometimes to a value judgment. I think you can say a lot of things are historic, and you can justify them through a lot of different means or a lot of different criteria. I don't know if that helps, but yeah, when you're applying for grants, a lot of times they're looking for, has this been recorded in some way? Is it National Register eligible? You know, that's another thing. Does it have the criteria? If it's not listed already, does it meet a certain criteria?
That's good to know. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I'm going to open this up to anybody that has a question for Jennifer. I also just emailed the resources document. If you didn't get it, just let me know. There was a lot of copying and pasting.
Yeah, there's more info in there on paint, on, I try to provide the National Park Service preservation briefs, I think are really helpful if you have questions about not only criteria, but specific issues like carpentry repair or just technical issues. Those are all really good. So definitely check those out if you have a question on something specific.
I'm sure that this is a major concern, and the cost of some of this work and the skilled labor that's required.
Yep.
You know, could you talk a little bit about that and what you're seeing? You know, sometimes they're great intentions, but the skill level isn't there to do something properly.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And this is something a number of different nonprofits are trying to address, because a lot of people are also retiring. So who's going to be the next generation of skilled tradespeople that can really do carpentry work? And certainly I'm trying to think, I in the PDF, I've included, if you're not familiar already with Preservation Mass, keeps a list of contractors that specialize in historic building trades. So that's one resource at least to check on. And I know that we're always trying to build up the skills, not only of our team. We have basically a carpentry team here, but we take on now a fellow every year. So someone that's new and that's training to be in the field. I know in Providence, they have a special window restoration program, Providence Preservation Society, where they're trying to teach high school students that might be interested in trade to consider historic preservation. I think repair, or I hope repair, I think repair is going to become a really important part of our overall model as we shift more to reusing buildings as resources, you know, are tighter. So I think you're absolutely right. Right now it's difficult, but I'm hopeful that we are training a new generation of people to do work in a traditional way. But you're totally right that I'm always struggling to find somebody to do the right work on the right project. So once you find that person, it's like they're on my speed dial.
Yes, or have the tools, the physical tools to be able to do something.
Right.
Yeah. No, I grew up in a family of, my grandfather left the farm, started putting standing seamed roofs on barns in Wisconsin and ventilators, and it was all done by hand. And he had all the tools, and that's what we played with as kids. You know, we played with the brakes. We played with the flux pots and all that kind of stuff.
That's so cool.
But you can't find that stuff anymore.
It's true.
Are there any other questions? We're upon the half hour, actually a minute past, but thank you so much,
Jack?
Jennifer.
Oh, I think Jack had a question. Jack?
Oh, Jack.
Yeah, hi, yeah, if you have a minute, I'm Jack Glassman. I chair the BSA Historic Resources Committee, and I work for the Park, and I work for the Park Service as a historical
Oh,
architect.
so you know all the
Yeah.
ins and outs here.
Well, I was expecting this to be a great presentation, but it was just phenomenal from beginning to end, so
Oh,
thank you.
That's so good to
We-
know. 'Cause I tried to
we live
switch it
here
up
in-
a little bit.
Well, it was great. Yeah, we live here in Charlestown in an 1840s house that, so I looked with interest at the framing diagram there because our house is sort of transitional where it has some heavy timber corners and braces, but it also has stud walls. So, so it was a little bit of that in between where I always imagined it was like old school Yankee, carpenters that worked on it, even though there were these new technologies available. And then we had the roof was raised with a mansard. So it was sort of Greek revival-ish that then has
Oh,
a
wow.
mansard on top. But anyway, I loved, I was just thinking when you're talking about the new generations and all, I guess one point about cost is you could also look at a different way, which is that preservation, as we really know, creates local jobs. It's small scale, local, good for small businesses and local jobs rather than just sort of buying something new that's manufactured that maybe came from another country or from far away. So there are all those different environmental benefits. But I was also thinking when you said new generation, I stayed up too late last night and I was watching Nightline, and there was a feature about this, the woman that co-founded this group that's, I'm trying to remember the exact name, but it's basically like buy nothing, this whole sort of movement where people just, they have sort of online, it's moving forward. It's like just doing less consuming. Why buy stuff that you don't need? If someone doesn't need something, they just post it. And it's not barter, but it's really just like if somebody needs someone doesn't need a baby stroller anymore, then someone else gets it. And so you could apply that sort of to the same sort of thinking about building materials and just saving more, and reusing, even if it's not, sort of perfect. It is part of the, maybe you'd say Yankee tradition, especially
Yeah,
around here.
absolutely.
Like
Yeah.
in the Midwest or in New England.
And there
So
are
thank
some
you.
places, no, there are some places, and this is something I try to keep an eye on too, even internationally, that have really good building component reuse projects, and also like facilities that help you like sort through lots of different building materials, which would be great to see. Particularly because I was just in Martha's Vineyard and I saw people throwing like 18th century doors into a dumpster, and I just had a heart attack. No, I wanted to dive into the dumpster myself, but I'm like, I can't carry these back. So yeah, to see a place where you could really exchange materials would be really, really cool. So.
Wonderful. I think with that, we have to say adieu.
Okay.
Have a wonderful day. It looks like the sun is shining.
Yeah.
We have great weather this weekend, and thank you for attending. Jennifer, we will be in touch undoubtedly.
Okay, that sounds wonderful. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for attending, everyone.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye.
Bye.